sharp edge retention and scabbards. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now many of you will know that I sold an original 1796 light cavalry saber to Windlass, and they copied it and made these amazing things. They came out really well. I've been certainly very happy with the prototype that I've had, and I know other people out there have received theirs and been very happy with them as well. Now, I should briefly mention there are other companies making 1796 light cavalry sabers, but they are not terribly close to the originals. The only one that I would currently endorse and say is very close to original is the Windlass version, available through museum replicas, Atlanta Cutlery and various other places. Now this one came to me butter knife sharp, should we say, so kind of blunt but not with a thick edge, so ready to be sharpened. Now this is actually historically accurate, because this is how 19th century military swords left the factory. They weren't, for the most part, sharpened in the factory, they were sharpened at the regiment. So actually very historically accurate from that point of view as well. So what did I do when I wanted to have this sharpened? Now I could sharpen it myself, and it must be said, in the 19th century, lots of people sharpening swords didn't do a very good job. There was a wide spectrum, so sometimes at the bottom end of the scale, at the kind of crappiest end of the scale, we might get someone, the regimental armourer, who just runs a load of the sabres across a big old grinding wheel and puts a sort of edge on them, and it's pretty rubbish and it doesn't cut very well. At the other end of the spectrum, we actually see records of cavalry regiments when they're going on campaign, for example to Egypt or Sudan or Afghanistan or wherever, actually sending all of the regimental sabres off to a professional cutler to get them professionally sharpened. That's what I did with this. We'll come back to that in a second. And there's another thing as well, officers and sometimes cavalry regiments who were based in India did the same thing, but they did it with a sort of native, with an Indian professional sharpening service, cutler essentially. And there were specific people in India who actually that was their entire trade and their job, and that's what they did. And they did an amazing job. And there is a difference. There are different styles of sharpening. There's different angles, different edge bevels, but there's also different which direction you sharpen in and things like this. So we do find differences on the original antiques. So what did I do with this one? I sent this off to my friends at Emberleaf Workshops. I'll stick a link to them below, and they do a sword sharpening service, and I've had them sharpen a number of swords for me, which I use for test cutting martial arts practice purposes. And they've done an amazing job. It's been a learning process, because obviously they're initially primarily knife makers, very high-end, nice quality hunting knives. So they had to kind of change, obviously a longer blade, usually thicker blades, different edge bevels. They had to experiment with what worked, and you know, there was some hit and miss at the beginning, but they've ended up with something really sharp. So how does this come back to scabbards? Well, quite simply, I've now got an extremely sharp edge here, which I don't want to ruin. I don't want to have to take it back to Emberleaf, even though they're not far away from me. I don't want to have to take it back to them to have it resharpened, but it lives in a steel scabbard. Now, I'm going to gingerly and carefully take it out of the scabbard. You will notice that we have a single-edged sword here, so I don't have to worry about both edges coming into contact. I only have to worry about that front cutting edge coming into contact with other metal and potentially ruining my edge, or at least making it not as efficient as it currently is. So I let it, under gravity for the most part, rest against the back of the scabbard as I draw it out. Now, if I was wearing this sword, it would be that way round, on horse or on foot, and so I have to make sure that I push towards the back, pushing the back blunt edge towards the back of the scabbard as I draw it out, so that none of that front edge, there we go, comes into contact with the scabbard. Now, let's put this incredibly sharp sword down very gingerly and carefully for a second and talk about the scabbards. Why did they use iron and steel scabbards? Quite simply because they were durable. So within particularly 19th century militaries, and this runs over into the 20th century and back into the 18th century, they were concerned about economy. So if you're spending hundreds or thousands of pounds on swords for your military, you want the swords to last a long time, and you also want the scabbards to last a long time. And it was found through bitter experience on campaigning that leather or wood and leather scabbards got destroyed on campaign. I talked about this recently in application to medieval swords, that we should expect that historically medieval swords in wood and leather scabbards, very often the scabbards must have got broken and got damaged, and they must have been replaced many times during the lifespan of the sword, because the sword can massively outlast the scabbard. This is also true of things like Japanese swords, Indian swords, Chinese swords, and so on and so forth. So the advantage of a steel scabbard is it's highly durable, it lasts for potentially forever, and it protects the sword as well. It protects the sword's blade. The disadvantage, as we've just seen there, is the trouble of it blunting the blade. There's two ways that can happen. Either internally, it can bang against the inside of the tube, essentially, or when you're sheathing it and drawing it, it can rub against this throat here. So they did a number of things to mitigate those in the 19th century. One is they put liners in. So these actually have, the originals actually have wood and or leather liners inside the scabbard to prevent against the edge as you're riding along or walking around from the edge banging into the inside of the scabbard and blunting it. So that protects it there. However, that doesn't protect it when you're drawing and sheathing. So what I have to be super careful with this is that steel or iron throat, as it's called there, or locket. As we pass that through, we have to make sure that we keep the edge away from that, because obviously if we're repeatedly drawing and sheathing, you're essentially stripping off a fine surface, or you're abrading essentially, even if that's softer iron against harder steel, the hard steel blade against soft iron scabbard, it's going to rub away that finest level of the edge, and when you need it in combat, it's not going to perform as well. So the other thing they did to overcome that, later on, we'll talk about wood and leather scabbards in a second. The other thing they did later on to overcome that is, you'll notice this metallic locket up here is a funny colour. That's because it's made of what they call German silver, and that's about the hardness of brass, so it's distinctly softer than the steel blade. So even though there might be incidental rubbing of this is an original antique, incidentally, 1896 pattern, even though there might be incidental rubbing of the blade against the throat as you draw the thing out, it shouldn't be too bad because it's much, much softer than the steel blade. So that's better than iron. So that's another thing they did. And finally, of course, they went back to using leather or wood and leather scabbards. At the end of the 19th century in the British Army, this is what they did. So they actually decided in the end that it was better to maintain a sharp blade rather than necessarily worrying about how long your scabbard lasted, and when the scabbard was destroyed they replaced it. However, this is an officer's sword, and that is specific, certainly in the British Army, really to officers' swords, because they can afford to replace their scabbards. And they don't get quite as harshly treated as regimental swords, which worn by cavalry troopers, which get in the regiment for years and don't really get looked after by the troopers. So troopers' swords, even at the time of this wood and leather scabbard, still for the most part had steel scabbards. And incidentally, I would argue that's one of the large points why they eventually went, at the end of the 19th century, lots of militaries went to thrusting swords for cavalry over cutting swords, because they just couldn't keep their blooming cutting swords sharp. Whereas a sharp pointy object, whether it's a screwdriver or a sword, is always going to go through stuff. It doesn't actually need to be very sharp to do so because it's focused on a small point. So, the last thing I would say is to come back to medieval swords, and you could also apply this to Indian swords, Japanese swords, as I say, Chinese swords. They almost always had wood and leather scabbards. I should say, actually, we do have metal scabbards. They're not a purely 19th century invention. We have them all the way back in the Iron Age. So we actually find Iron Age swords with bronze scabbards sometimes. So there were metallic scabbards around all the way back in, technically, prehistory, I guess, in the kind of pre-Roman era. And you do find it in other parts of the world as well. But by and large, most cultures that valued having a sharp blade kept it in a wood and leather scabbard. But two things I want you to take away from this video is, number one, you should expect these to be perishable. Okay, think of them like a pair of shoes or, you know, a hat. They might last a fair time, but they will progressively get more and more shabby. They'll eventually fall apart. They won't necessarily be watertight anymore, and you'll have to replace them. Okay, so scabbards were and would have been pretty perishable. I won't say disposable, but perishable, like a pair of shoes. So you might repair them a few times and eventually they'd get beyond the pale and you'd have to replace them. But the other thing which I think gets overlooked is they aren't magical. They are simply a softer material than the steel or iron scabbards, okay? So yes, indeed, these will protect the edge, and same with a Japanese katana or, you know, an Indian talwar. The wood scabbard, the wood lining, won't damage the edge as much as a metal scabbard, but every time you rub that sharp edge past that wood, it is going to have an abrasive effect, just the same as how you polish things with a felt or a cloth buffing wheel. It still polishes the steel, but it does it much more slowly and much more softly. And so that will happen also with a wooden scabbard or a leather scabbard. They will have some effect on the sharpness. So even with these scabbards, the edge will have to be stropped or well, actually really sharpened and then stropped every now and again, just not as often as the steel scabbard. So once more, I hope that's been useful, and also kudos to Emberleaf Workshop, link below, for the sharpening they've done on this and a number of other swords for me, including some of the Royal Armourers line, because they've done an amazing and slightly scary job, and I'm very, very careful and have a lot of respect around these things. But it massively changes if you're used to handling blunt antiques, let's face it, because antiques are almost always blunt. When you handle something which is truly freshly sharpened, it makes you draw and sheath the sword in a very different way and gives you a new respect for the sharpness of the weapon, but also a disrespect for the nuisance of iron and steel scabbards, and particularly the iron or steel throats up here, which would just strip the edge off. Anyway, I hope that's been useful and interesting. Take care, folks, and I will see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.